My name is Lieutenant Colonel Nicole Turner, and at 38 years old I have spent nearly half my life learning that real strength has almost nothing to do with volume. It lives in stillness. It lives in the discipline to stay completely level when everything around you is coming apart, when the situation is deteriorating and the people depending on you need someone who has already decided how this ends. As an active commander in the United States Army leading a unit of elite rangers, I have operated in some of the harshest environments on Earth, managed high-stakes decisions under conditions that don't allow for hesitation, and earned the trust of soldiers who hand me their lives without reservation. None of that prepared me for pulling into my mother's diner parking lot on a quiet afternoon and seeing what I saw through the front glass window, my anchor through every deployment, every rotation, every stretch of months spent far from anything familiar, had always been home. And at the center of home was my mother, Evelyn. She was 75 years old, a woman built entirely from warmth and work and the particular kind of selflessness that never announces itself because it's simply the way someone moves through the world. After my father died more than a decade ago, she turned her grief into purpose and poured every available part of herself into the roadside dine. They had run together. The coffee was always hot. The door was always open. On mornings when her joints were burning and her body was asking her to rest, she stood behind that counter anyway, because the diner was not just a business. It was the place my father's memory was most alive, and keeping it going was the most direct way she knew to keep him present. When I finally had a stretch of leave approved, the only thing I wanted was to set down the weight of command for a few days and sit at her counter the way I had as a kid. I brought a few off-duty members of my unit with me, soldiers I trusted completely, men I wanted to show the town that had shaped me before the military finished the job. None of us were expecting anything beyond a quiet dinner and the particular peace that comes from being somewhere that knew you before you became whoever you are now. What we drove into was something else entirely. For 6 months before my return, a man named Vance had been making my mother's life increasingly difficult in the methodical, escalating way that people with money and local influence tend to do when they've decided they want something and aren't accustomed to being told no. He was a land developer with a reputation built on pressure and predatory offers, and a network of local officials who had found it professionally convenient to accommodate him. He didn't negotiate in good faith because he had never needed to. He identified what he wanted, made an offer calibrated to be insulting enough to establish dominance, and then applied increasing pressure until the person across from him concluded that cooperation was less costly than resistance. My mother's diner sat on a prime corner lot at the edge of the main highway, exactly where Vance needed it for the commercial development project. He had been assembling piece by piece. He came in with lowball offers she politely declined. He came back with more aggressive ones she declined again. He had not encountered this particular variety of resistance before. Not obstinacy, not ignorance of his reach, just a woman who understood precisely what was being offered and what was being asked in return, and who had already made her decision. That land was not a financial asset to her. It was her husband's legacy and her life's work, and the physical location of everything that mattered. And no number he put in front of her was going to change the math on that. His polite inquiries had long since become daily threats by the time my squad's truck pulled into the gravel lot. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent, and the diner should have been carrying the familiar sounds of early dinner service, light conversation, the clink of cutlery, the particular ambient noise of a busy small-town restaurant. Instead, the parking lot was wrapped in a silence that registered as wrong. Before I had fully processed why, I swung down from the vehicle and looked through the front glass window. And what I saw made my blood go cold in a way that has nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with the specific alertness that takes over when the mind recognizes a threat that is already in progress inside. The diner had the frozen quality of a room where something has gone badly wrong, and everyone present is operating in survival mode. Half a dozen regular patrons sat in their booths staring at the floor with the studied stillness of people who have calculated that invisibility is their best available option. Near the counter stood a man in a tailored suit, Vance, flanked by two security guards built for discouragement. He was leaning over the Formica counter with his face flushed, and his voice carrying the particular ugliness of someone who has never learned to manage their own frustration. because other people have always managed the consequences of it for them. He was calling my mother a stubborn old fool. He was telling her she would sign the property transfer today, or find herself without a roof over her head by morning. My mother stood behind that counter with her chin up, trembling, but upright, her voice steady when she told him the land was not for sale and asked him to leave. That steadiness infuriated him in the specific way that calm always infuriates people who are accustomed to fear as a management tool. His control broke. He raised his open hand and struck her across the face with enough force that the sound carried through the glass to where I was standing outside. She went down behind the counter, out of sight, and he laughed, a loud, deliberate, performed laugh directed at the frozen patrons, and asked whether anyone else wanted to tell him no. The bell above the front door chimed softly as I pushed it open and stepped inside, my squad following close behind me. I was in civilian clothes. Nothing about my appearance signaling anything beyond an ordinary woman who had just walked in from the parking lot. The frozen patrons looked up, Vance turned slowly, the smug expectation already ranging itself on his face before he had fully registered who had entered, because he had already decided this moment belonged to him and that whatever came through that door was a manageable interruption. The years of training that prepare you for high-stress tactical environments don't disappear when you put on civilian clothes. What they do is compress, all of it pulling inward into a cold, precise focus that is actually more effective than adrenaline because it doesn't cloud anything. I walked straight past the patrons, past the counter, and stood 10 feet from Vance. And when I told him to step away from the counter, my voice was quiet enough that he had to stop, smirking to hear me. He looked me over with the practiced contempt of a man who has spent years winning through intimidation and has come to believe that his read of a situation is always correct. He asked who I was supposed to be. He said it with the specific inflection of someone who is already certain the answer is irrelevant. I told him I was her daughter and that he needed to move away from my mother immediately. He threw his head back and delivered the speech that men like him keep ready for moments like this, about how he ran the county, about the mayor and the sheriff and the judges, about how my mother had made a bad business decision and was paying the price, about how one more step in his direction would land both of us in a cell before dark. I didn't respond to the speech. I moved past him as though he were a piece of furniture, went around the counter, and knelt beside my mother on the floor. Her lip was bleeding and her cheek was already swelling, but her eyes found mine and she said my name in a voice that was weak but present. I told her I had her. I told her she was safe, and I helped her up into the nearest chair with the care that the moment required. And then I stood back up and turned around. While I had been tending to my mother, the 3 off-duty soldiers who had come in with me had moved without a word spoken between them. They didn't draw anything. They didn't raise their voices. They simply repositioned themselves with the quiet efficiency of men who have trained for situations where positioning is everything. And they had closed off every exit and placed themselves between Vance's guards and any path forward. The guards recognized what they were looking at before Vance did. Their instincts understood it even if their minds were still catching up. They stopped moving and stayed stopped. Vance's composure developed its first visible crack. He demanded to know who he thought we were. I reached into my pocket, produced my military identification, and held it where he could read it clearly. I told him my name and my rank and my unit, and I explained that the woman he had just struck was a military dependent, and that while he had been delivering his speech about owning the local sheriff, my team had already placed calls to the state police and the military police corps. I told him they were pulling up outside as we spoke. The red and blue light began strobing through the diner windows before I finished the sentence. He turned toward the glass and watched state trooper cruisers and military police vehicles filling the parking lot. And whatever remained of his confidence went somewhere I couldn't see and didn't come back. Officers came through the door within seconds. The lead trooper looked at my identification, looked at my mother behind the counter with her swollen face, and the nature of what he had walked into rearranged itself from a local disturbance into something requiring significantly more serious attention. Vance tried. He said his name as though it were a credential. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said he practically funded the town. The trooper told him to stop talking, noted the room full of witnesses, noted the 75-year-old woman with a bleeding lip, and put handcuffs on him while he was still attempting to explain why the rules that applied to other people didn't apply to him. The security guards offered no resistance. There was nothing left to guard. What Vance had not accounted for, in all his calculation about local influence and purchase loyalty, was that striking my mother had moved the situation entirely outside the jurisdiction of anyone he owned. State authorities and federal officers don't answer to county officials, and the moment their documentation of the incident was underway, the network of local protection he had spent years assembling became irrelevant. Within 48 hours, the state attorney general had opened a full investigation into his business dealings, and what investigators found was a pattern that had been operating for years behind the protection of the very officials he had been boasting about: extortion, unlawful coercion, predatory practices against small business owners who had been too isolated and too frightened to believe that anyone would listen, felony assault charges, extortion indictments, and civil lawsuits that added up to a number that would occupy lawyers for years. He was walked out of my mother's diner in handcuffs, and the confidence that had been his defining characteristic didn't survive the parking lot. 2 months later, the diner looked the way it was supposed to look: morning light through clean windows, the smell of fresh coffee and toast, the sound of actual conversation among people who were no longer afraid of who might walk through the door. The shadow that Vance had cast over the town for years was gone, and in its absence, other business owners who had been living inside it came forward with their own accounts, encouraged by the evidence that standing up was survivable, that someone had finally demonstrated it. My mother sat behind her counter with the same warmth she had been distributing across that counter for 40 years, her face fully healed, her spirit genuinely unchanged by what she had survived. When my leave ended and I had to return to base, I drove away knowing she was surrounded by a community that had found its footing again, and by the weight of a legacy that was going to outlast both of us. Everything I have learned about strength through years of military command points to the same truth. From different angles, power that exists only to dominate is fundamentally fragile, because it depends entirely on the people it's aimed at having no one in their corner. The moment that changes, the whole structure collapses. Bullies build their empires on the assumption that their targets are alone. Show them otherwise, and there is nothing left to sustain what they've built. My mother had never been alone. She simply hadn't needed anyone to stand beside her until the afternoon she did. And on that afternoon, I was exactly where I was supposed to be.